Welcome to Clinical Trial Blazers, a podcast by Parexel Biotech, where we dive deep into the journeys of the industry leaders who are shaping clinical research and biotech innovation. I am your host, Alberto Grignolo. If you enjoy these conversations, please take a moment to rate, review, and follow the podcast on your favorite platform. It really helps more listeners discover the show. Today on Clinical Trial Blazers, my guest is Reenie McCarthy, the CEO of Mighty Therapeutics, formerly known as Stealth Biotherapeutics. Reenie's journey to the CEO role reflects a steady progression from functional leadership into full enterprise responsibility. In 2025, she successfully led the company through one of the most challenging paths in biotech, developing and ultimately securing FDA approval for elamiprotide, a therapy for Barth syndrome, a rare and historically incurable disease. This process required not just scientific and regulatory rigor, but persistence and the ability to navigate setbacks and funding pressures. Reenie previously led the US-based investment team of Morningside Ventures from 1993 through 2015. That experience gave her a unique perspective on how to build resilient organizations and navigate the inevitable ups and downs of innovation. Reenie brings a pragmatic and determined leadership style, and today we'll explore the key moments and decisions that shaped her path, including how she turned a regulatory setback challenge into an opportunity to strengthen Mighty's future and deepen their commitment to patients with Barth syndrome. Reenie McCarthy, welcome.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you today.
You recently changed the company name from Stealth Biotherapeutics to Mighty Therapeutics. You've gone from stealthy to mighty. So what prompted that change, and what does the new name signal about the company's next chapter?
Really the name change was prompted as a means to celebrate the patient community that has really led us to this approval. When you think about a disease like Barth syndrome, it is very, very rare. This is a very small group of patients and their families working, towards therapeutic options for which there have previously been none. And even more broadly, in the mitochondrial disease community, you've got similarly a collection of very small, very rare mitochondrial diseases. We've been so impressed and inspired and motivated really by these patient communities that as we bring our science out of, stealth mode, as it were, really to the first approval of the first mitochondrial targeted therapeutic, we wanted to celebrate those patient communities. And that's really the choice of name reflects that. These are small but very mighty communities. And we hope we can live up to their grit and determination as we move forward.
When you stepped into the CEO role at Stealth, which is now Mighty, what were the immediate priorities, and how quickly did you realize the hardest part of the job? Did you realize that quickly or more gradually over time? What made the job tough, if it did?
I was really stepping in on an interim basis. We were looking to sort of stabilize leadership at the company and define strategic priorities going forward, working with the management team. When you talk about diseases of mitochondrial dysfunction, the potential is almost limitless in terms of mitochondria being involved in almost every aspect of human health and disease. And so I think that partnering with the management team that were very seasoned executives, drug developers, and defining that vision and moving forward was the first priority. I was really gratified to be asked by my co-executives to stay on in the role, really moving from interim to full-time permanent CEO. And I would say one of the biggest challenges was the learning curve that took, right? Learning all things mitochondria, deep dive into the science and also into aspects of drug development that as an investor and a board member, we certainly know of, but you don't know the nitty-gritty day-to-day aspects.
Was Stealth initially funded by Morningside, where you had worked for many years?
Yeah, so I remember the first trip down to meet the scientific founder in New York. So this was technology that was discovered by scientists at Weill Cornell Medical and Institut de Recherche de Montreal. So I remember those early meetings, and we, again, were just really intrigued by the potential to target mitochondria, previously undruggable target, but so centrally important to human health and ultimately human disease.
I'd like to go back to the early part of your career. I'm interested in what drew you into the life sciences industry and how did your path evolve towards a broader leadership role? You've already made some allusion to it, but I'm interested in going upstream from that. How did you become interested in the life sciences in the first place?
Probably serendipity. I mean, I always liked life science and, biology, chemistry, and that, but I went to law school. I was a transactional attorney. I joined the team at Morningside, originally focused on financial market aspects of the Morningside investment thesis. But Morningside has always also had a very deep and abiding interest in developing novel therapeutics that can potentially affect paradigm shifts in healthcare, right? I think the Morningside mission, came out of public health initially. And so really looking for novel scientific opportunities with the willingness to come in early and stay long through some of the ups and downs that we invariably encounter when we're looking to develop really novel first-in-class science. And so I evolved, I suppose, into doing more of the biotech investing. And as I mentioned, stealth was something that was particularly intriguing because I did have those early meetings with the scientific founders. I was on the board of the company from the outset. And again, we just saw the potential as being potentially transformational.
Was your progression to becoming CEO something you were deliberately working towards, maybe during your years at Morningside? Were you thinking, someday I'd like to be the CEO of one of our portfolio companies? Or did it emerge through a series of opportunities? You mentioned serendipity a little while ago.
So a lot of serendipity in the stealth story, including in mine. No, this was an opportunity. We were looking again to kind of build out the company from what had been previously more of a virtual model into bricks and mortars. There was a bit of a leadership gap that we needed to plug. And as a board member, I stepped in on an interim basis to do that. I never imagined it would stick. And as I mentioned, it was like drinking from a fire hose in the early days, getting up to speed, not only on, a deeper dive into the science, but also all the different functional areas that go into biotech drug development.
Can we talk about Barth syndrome? And for those who may not be as familiar with it as you, obviously are you and your team, what is Barth syndrome and how does it impact the patients who suffer from it?
It's a really devastating disease of mitochondrial dysfunction. In Barth syndrome, patients have a genetic mutation that leads ultimately to a 70 to 95% reduction in a mitochondrial phospholipid called cardiolipin, which is the target of our drug. Think of cardiolipin as, in its simplest terms, the glue of the electron transport chain, which is the cellular machinery that makes energy, right? So mitochondria fuel about 90% of our energy needs. We can't live without them. And what mitochondria do is they make energy. Without cardiolipin, we also can't survive. Given that significant deficit in cardiolipin, the disease can be embryonic lethal. Historically, 85% of children died before the age of 5 years old, about 50% of early mortality within the first year of life. So this can be a really devastating pediatric disease. And for children who survive early childhood, they're going to have significant risk going into their teenage years. Growth takes energy, puberty takes energy. And so we see reemergence of heart failure and symptoms exacerbating during the teenage years. And then typically these patients have not historically lived, beyond their fourth decade of life. Now, with earlier diagnosis, better medical management, we're starting to see longer lifespans, which is terrific. But the disease continues to wreak havoc on survivors in terms of a progressive muscle myopathy. I've heard people say, some days you have to make a choice between, taking a shower and brushing your teeth. Like the fatigue, the muscle weakness can be that devastating for folks affected by this disease. So it is a life-limiting disease and also a life-threatening disease.
There must be mobility issues associated with it as well, right? Ability to walk or move.
It depends on the patients. Assistive devices can be required. Heart transplants affect about 20% of the patient population, don't address the mobility issues. And a lot of this really is sort of the devastating associated fatigue. That means that patients even if they can get up and walk to make themselves a meal, for example, they would literally have to rest for hours after, expending the energy to do an activity like that.
Speaking of the rarity of this condition, I understand there are only 2 clinics in the world that specialize in Barth syndrome. Is that correct?
Well, there's 2 more now since our approval. There's 2 additional multidisciplinary centers that have been opened in the United States following the approval of elamiprotide, which is called Forzinity, for the treatment of Barth syndrome. This was an accelerated approval received for boys weighing more than 30 kilograms with the disease. And with that, some additional centers in the U.S. have definitely opened clinics. But yes, historically, there was 1 clinic in Bristol and the other really worldwide leading clinic at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, which is where we conducted our clinical trials. Known in the United States, a patient registry maintained by Patient Advocacy has only about 150 patients enrolled in it. So this is a very, very rare disease. We do think that there is significant underdiagnosis of this disease. And so one of the goals, right, is to educate better so that patients can get diagnosed earlier, which can introduce the potential of early treatment with not just our compound, which again is more for weighing over 30 kilograms, but there are other, therapies to address like the neutropenia. These patients are prone to frequent infections that can be truly life-saving for young children.
Does providing education include providing education in medical schools so that medical students will be aware of Barth syndrome as their education progresses?
I think there's actually a question on the boards about Barth syndrome. Barth syndrome Patient Advocacy did a good job sort of trying to, do some of those early educational efforts, but for sure, we want to improve education and awareness. For some of these very rare pediatric cardiomyopathies, historically, patients might be diagnosed with idiopathic cardiomyopathy, so unknown origins. And what we see in the Barth syndrome patient community is that about half of the boys in our clinical trial weren't diagnosed until they were adults. And the reason for the diagnosis was the birth of a young cousin or sibling or someone in the family in acute cardiac distress, and somebody thought to run a genetic panel. And that's when the Barth syndrome diagnosis was made. And even more heartbreakingly, sometimes it's a second child. So one child is lost to the disease and, they find out on autopsy that it was Barth syndrome. And so the next child born, to look for those symptoms. So that can be quite heartbreaking. I think that we are seeing more inclination to utilize genetic testing in the setting of unexpected cardiomyopathy in babies. The testing prices have come down. And again, disease awareness will also prompt geneticists to try to run a panel.
So Mighty's work in Barth syndrome represents a remarkable and very difficult journey. You'll know that much better than I would. Can you walk me through the biggest scientific and regulatory challenges you faced in getting the drug to FDA approval?
This is a series of firsts, right? It's a first-in-class therapy. So mitochondrial targeted therapeutics, this is the first and only one that's been approved that directly targets the mitochondria. So there's education around that. There's learning around how preclinical data translates into clinical data. I think one of the things we very much learned in the setting of Barth syndrome is that although in mice we might see changes within a week or a month, in people who have been living with lifelong progressive disease, it would take 9 months, a year, 18 months before we see a clinical benefit. And so those were learnings in the setting of trials that resulted in early data being disappointing. And in a setting of a disease this rare, you run into a challenge of ever being able to conduct another clinical trial because there are so few patients to participate. So I think that the challenges we encountered were a combination of those translational learnings, which are very common with first-in-class therapies, in the setting of a disease that is so rare that it is challenging to continue to conduct new studies, and the need to educate regulators, frankly, about the mechanism of both the drug and the disease itself. So it took a lot of work and a lot of time. We were able to have the support and certainly inspired by the patients to continue long-term study and open label extension. We adopted strategies like doing natural history control comparisons that told us we wouldn't expect to see the changes we were seeing in the natural history of the disease. And we just continued our discussions with the FDA towards what eventually was an accelerated approval of our drug on the basis of improvements of knee extensor muscle strength.
That was presumably a surrogate endpoint.
Intermediate clinical endpoint, yes.
Can you share any detail or insights around how you educated FDA about Barth syndrome, if you needed to do so?
Our journey was very unique in that we moved through 4 different review divisions at the FDA. So I think that was
which
always...
ones?
We were in the division of neurology. We moved over into DGIEP, so essentially gastroenterology, which then got reorganized into rare disease and medical genetics, and eventually moved from there into cardiology. So that was a lot of review divisions over, a 4 to 5 year period that we moved through.
So did you have to re-educate every successive division as you were moved from one to the other? Did you have to restart the education process, if you will?
To some extent, although I think that the FDA actually did a very good job in inviting multiple divisions to some of our meetings in the later years. And up until this year, where we were in a meeting to talk about what we would need to do to broaden the label to include younger children, right, which will require additional studies. But we've aligned with the FDA on how to do that. Very constructive meeting in February with the agency, where again, they invited multiple divisions because, we're sitting in cardiology, but many of our endpoints were muscle related, right? So that suggests that neurology should have a seat at the table. Pediatrics should have a seat at the table because we're trying to get this down to younger children. And so it's great to see the FDA bringing all those resources into a meeting, obviously for a very rare disease, to try to inform how best to, again, broaden access to this therapy. So yes, it did require re-education, but also I think the FDA tried to facilitate the ease within which we could do that by inviting multiple groups to the table. The bigger thing for us was to have the patients involved at every step of the way. So we had patient advocacy with us for every single FDA meeting that we went to. And we had the leading thought leaders from the Barth syndrome professional community. So the doctors at Hopkins, for example, and others around the world also really joining us for many of those meetings. We tried to model a very transparent regulatory process by involving patients, patient advocacy, and thought leaders at every step of the way.
Did you find that the agency was receptive to hearing the voice of the patients directly during those meetings?
The agency is always receptive to hearing the voice of the patient. The question is how much the voice of the patient can inform regulatory decision-making and understanding of the unique challenges that face the patient population. We had over, probably 20 meetings with the FDA. Patient advocacy separately met a half dozen times with the FDA to educate about the unmet need and just how rare this disease is, like how hard it is to do an additional clinical trial. We proposed maybe a dozen different protocols for either pre-approval or post-marketing studies. And one of the big challenges the FDA had was number of patients. Like, can't you find more patients and power this better? And the answer was no. I mean, we actually can't, not in any kind of feasible time period. And so I think that was just something that continued education helped to get the agency comfortable with.
Okay.
I mean, the FDA came to that accelerated approval decision late for us. They had told the advisory committee that this would be full approval, or really that was supposed to be considered. And so coming to that decision late, they then worked with us to get to an approval before we had started those confirmatory studies. They got comfortable with, I think, our commitment. We had stuck with this for a very long time, that we would do what we said we were going to do and, approve the drug with a clear line of sight to the final protocol and what types of milestones we hope to achieve.
accelerated approvals are sometimes controversial, and they hit the public media, and there are internal disagreements within the agency before a final decision is made. If you can say, was anything like that happening in your situation where, in fact, this approval was not as smooth as you might have wished?
We actually published our complete response letter, or we collaborated with Pink Sheet to get that out over the summer of 2025, because we knew that there was extreme public interest in this, including from the patient community, and we wanted to ensure transparency. FDA itself published our complete response letter after that, and we can look at what the review said. I think that there was a lot of discussion within the agency about whether, the evidence showed substantial evidence of effectiveness, because, again, very small patient numbers. We did not see a signal in the randomized control portion of our clinical trial. It was very short. It was only 3 months of treatment. The signals we observed were really in baseline controlled or natural history controlled studies, which are acceptable from a regulatory science perspective as controls, but not preferred, obviously, for the agency. And so I think that there was a lot of internal discussion about whether we had met the bar. Again, I think the accelerated approval pathway is an approach that allows the agency to require more information, which makes sense for the public interest, but also meets the current needs of the patient population to have access to a therapy.
So you've committed to additional post-marketing studies.
So several post-marketing studies, but the main one to confirm clinical benefit is a study that will be conducted outside the U.S. It's a randomized controlled clinical trial of up to 48 patients with Barth syndrome, being conducted in Europe, Australia, Canada, and China. And we have screened our first patient on time relative to what we suggested to the FDA we would do. And so we're making progress on that trial per our commitment. As I mentioned, we also met recently with the agency to talk about a pathway to access in the US under our label for children as young as age 5. We are studying those children in the post-marketing study conducted outside the US, but needed a path to hopefully expedite access to those patients in the US. And there, the FDA told us if we do a pharmacokinetic study, so to really measure how the drug is processed in younger children to inform dosing, that would need to enroll 5 to 6 patients, and that could inform label expansion down to age 5. So we're also currently working to initiate that study, hopefully later this summer.
For the non-US randomized control trial, what is the control group?
It's placebo. We've committed to providing open label access to every participant in that clinical trial until marketing authorization and, frankly, access is granted in the country in which they reside. So this
following the completion of the study.
Yeah. So, following their completion of the study. Yeah. So this is 18 months of requiring a placebo for a disease that has no other therapies. I think if that's a path to broader access, then so be it. But we have committed to providing access. We currently provide expanded or emergency access to children worldwide presenting in an emergency situation with Barth syndrome. So we are already providing access as best as we are able to children around the world who are not within our label in the U.S. Again, in an emergency situation with Barth syndrome. The trial is studying more stable patients with the disease, and again, with the guarantee that we will continue access following their completion of the study.
And I guess you have to balance the willingness to provide access with the need to enroll sufficient numbers of patients in the ongoing trial.
Indeed.
To be able to complete it. So is that a difficult balance to achieve?
I think it's an education process for patients so that they understand why this is needed.
How do Barth patients currently benefit from elranatamab?
The drug is indicated to improve muscle strength in patients living with Barth syndrome. That was really an assessment of knee extensor muscle strength. It's interesting because that's an intermediate clinical endpoint because it was one muscle group. But when we think about the centrality of muscle weakness in this disease, it is somewhat to the surprise of patient advocacy, the theme that came out of the patient-focused drug development meeting conducted in 2018 as the most problematic symptom experienced by patients. So I think moms and dads of children with this disease would think the heart failure, because that can be lethal. But for patients living with the disease, it's the fact that they can't do activities of daily living. And if they do, the associated fatigue is so debilitating. So muscle weakness really did emerge as the most problematic symptom for patients. And so I think that for us, it's a very appropriate benefit that we have reflected in the label, that the drug can potentially, again, improve muscle weakness in this disease.
Every drug development story, of course, has moments where things don't go as planned, and you referred to some of these. Do you want to say anything more about any setbacks that you encountered along the way and how you and your team responded?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for us, when we read out on the data from the double-blind placebo-controlled portion of the trial, it was very disappointing. What kept us in the game was that we had done semi-structured interviews with patients and their caregivers, and we were hearing from them, as well as from the investigator in the trial, that patients were reporting improvements and the investigator was observing improvements. And we looked at the open label data, and sure enough, we were seeing pretty consistent and durable improvements for all patients who continued into open label. And so for us, it was, I think, suspending the disbelief that you would normally have if your p-values don't come out the way they should in a randomized control study, and getting to understand that in this disease, seeing the consistency and durability of improvements was unexpected, and maybe the best we can do in a disease this incredibly rare, that led us to really, persist in our development efforts and try to find ways to contextualize for the FDA why this data was suitable for an NDA submission and eventually an approval. We listened to the patients, and I think that in this case, that really is the story that brought us across the line.
And so it is that story, that evidence that I suppose sustained your optimism and your willingness to go forward even when the outcome might have felt somewhat uncertain, or was your certainty of the outcome improving on the strength of those data?
Our conviction that we should keep going was improving on the strength of those data. Our certainty in the outcome was not. No, this was definitely a slog all along the way. We did have a positive advisory committee meeting and, positive vote for full approval in 2024, which definitely provided some encouragement. And even when we got the complete response letter in mid-2025, it did point to a path towards approval. So I think from October 2024 onward, we did see a glimmer of hope in the distance that we would be able to, eventually prevail. But I think before that, it was very much a series of ups and downs.
Complete response letters sometimes are viewed as negative, but sounds like in your case it provided you with a degree of clarity and eventually, in a fairly short time frame, a path to approval. Would that be fair to say that the CRL actually was helpful?
100%. The CRL was really due to a manufacturing issue, which eventually was a voluntary action only, but it came up right at the very end. Reading between the lines, I think the agency also made a late pivot to accelerated approval, which did require them to want some clarity on our post-marketing plan. And so it gave us the time to bring that clarity to the agency. Every meeting we had with the agency after the complete response letter was incredibly collaborative, informative, and I would say straightforward, which previously you were trying to read tea leaves, right? I think the agency, starting with that CRL and through our February meeting this year, post-approval, has been incredibly clear in what their expectations are and in what we could do to meet them. And that's been super helpful.
Was there a sense of joint mission with the company and the agency, feeling on both sides that we're all here to help patients with this rare, devastating condition? Was there a sense of shared mission?
I think certainly once the FDA got comfortable with the decision they made to move towards the accelerated approval, yes, there has been a sense of shared mission. When we met with the agency in February, that even extended to, again, giving us this path to age 5, but then talking about younger children. There have been, published case studies of our emergency access provision to younger children. And the agency, I think, is understanding we can't do a placebo-controlled trial in babies with Barth syndrome, but, gave us strategies to collect additional data through a registry that may eventually inform their ability to make a decision there as well. So I think that at this point, there really is a sense of shared mission to try to get to a place informed by data that is best for patients.
Let's take this up to 50,000 feet. Based on this experience, how has it shaped your perspective on what it takes to build a sustainable, mission-driven biotech company?
I think that for us, it's been, really kind of keeping in mind that patients are central to our mission, obviously strongly informed by science. There have been cases where we would have loved to have seen programs work and they just haven't, and we didn't believe that the science supported keeping, moving forward. But in cases where we think the science does support moving forward, really being very committed to that patient-focused mission and working collaboratively with patient groups and with thought leaders and with regulators to find the appropriate path forward.
Biotech innovation depends on sustained investment. So how did you approach securing funding for the company during particularly critical phases, especially when the regulatory path was complex and high risk?
I think you need to pursue a lot of different innovative strategies in a situation like this, right, which was very complicated with a lot of ups and downs. We were a public company. We were then taken private. We have done partnership deals along the way that, some of which, didn't work when we saw trial failures and other indications. But all of that taken together, was able to sustain the company through to the approval. We looked at debt options, but at the end of the day for us, Morningside has been incredibly supportive. And so we did have that early stage, very long-term investor that was willing to be patient when they believed that, we had a therapy that could offer a paradigm shift to the treatment of human disease. And so that for us was really key. But even with such a committed investor, I think looking at other ways to finance the company, we've brought in grant financing to keep some of our pipeline programs alive. And we've prioritized and deprioritized different programs so that we could sustain the focus through to the approval for Barth syndrome.
What lessons would you share with other biotech leaders who are navigating other complex journeys or trying to bring a new therapy to market? What qualities, for you personally as a CEO and of your team, made this success possible? What would you recommend to others?
I think for many biotechs, there will be ups and downs, and the ability to navigate those and move forward with a core team of dedicated individuals around you probably turns on transparency and mission-driven purpose, right? So we've been very transparent with our team and with patient advocacy along this journey about what the risks are, what the challenges are, what we have to do to get through the next phase. That has made us all partners together in this process, and I think just reinforced that sense of mission. I think it takes a lot of creativity as well in terms of finding some of those innovative financing strategies, being willing to pivot when necessary to cut costs in one area to support continued spend in another. But it's really grit inspired by mission, I think, that gets you through the ups and downs of biotech development.
As the CEO and therefore the face of the company to investors, to patients, to regulators, to the world, what qualities of yours do you think have made you successful? And this is no time to be modest, Reenie.
Qualities of mine. I'm a good communicator, and I believe in what we're doing. And I think that sharing that in a transparent way with my team and with the patient community has kept everyone on the same page. we strongly believe in the potential of mitochondrial medicine to improve human disease, like for Barth syndrome and more broadly. Like, we really believe in this approach as scientists and as developers. And we have a real human connection to the Barth syndrome community because we've worked with them for so long and seen the potential improvement that patients are experiencing in their muscle strength and how that's impacting their day-to-day lives. So I think that, being open to sort of the human aspect of what you're developing, and very firmly grounded in the scientific potential and communicating that, right? It's that trifecta that really, allows me to lead the team the way I do.
Will Mighty and you pursue additional mitochondrial indications in addition to your, of course, commitment to Barth?
Absolutely. We are moving forward with a program in another rare mitochondrial disease, which is polymerase gamma mutations. We've seen clinical data there that is very compelling in terms of our ability to do another study. We've had early meetings with the FDA on that. And we're also in very late stage clinical development for dry age-related macular degeneration, which is the leading cause of blindness for older adults in the Western world. I think they're bringing bioenergetics to the forefront. Our retinas consume a lot of mitochondrial energy. And so this is a way that, maybe we can restore, right, the bioenergetic balance versus just sort of, shutting down pathways that may be leading to inflammation in that disease.
So it sounds like your path is going to evolve from focusing on ultra-rare conditions to highly prevalent conditions like macular degeneration.
We think mitochondrial dysfunction is central to many diseases. So I think that for us as a company, we are agnostic in our development efforts as between rare diseases and more common diseases. In terms of our ability to launch and deliver medicines to market once approved, I think there we see the rare disease space as being our strongest strength. For bigger diseases like dry AMD, we'd likely be looking for partnerships.
Well, Reenie, this brings us to the end of our wonderful conversation. I really thank you for your insights and the qualities you bring to drug development. So that wraps up this episode. And again, I really thank you for your time and insights.
Yeah, thank you. This is a fun conversation. Appreciate the opportunity.
That wraps up this episode of Clinical Trial Blazers. Big thank you to you, Reenie McCarthy, CEO of Mighty Therapeutics, for joining us today and sharing your perspective on your adventure with the company and with Barth syndrome and the persistence and resilience that it took to take it through the finish line. Be sure to join us for upcoming episodes of Clinical Trial Blazers, where we dive into the people and stories driving innovation across biopharma and biotech. Clinical Trial Blazers is produced by Parexel Biotech and hosted by me, Alberto Grignolo, with production support from ACAST Productions. Thank you for listening. Until next time, stay curious and continue advancing the future of clinical research.